I will say today we have the incredible privilege to Emir Hashem begin the third parak of Maseches Moed Katan, Daf Yud Dalej, page 14a. We are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on Yud Gimel Amud Beis 13b. So the Mishnah says as follows: Ve'elu magalchin b'moed. These are the individuals who are permitted to go ahead, and magalchin, giluach, usually means both shaving as well as hair cutting. So these are the individuals who are permitted to engage in shaving and hair cutting. Now, the Mishnah presupposes that we know that shaving and hair cutting is asar and chalamayid. Where that comes from, Emir Hashem will see in the Gemara. Ve'elu magalchin b'moed. These are the individuals who have a license to shave and get a haircut and chalamayid. Haba midinas hayam, someone who returns from overseas travel, or mibeis hashivya, someone who was held in captivity, vayotze mibeis hasurin, or someone who was incarcerated, vamenuda shetilo chachamim, someone who was excommunicated. Often, again, nidui was the result of someone who failed to comply with certain directives of a beis din, certain obligations in community, and as a result, he's excommunicated. Part of his excommunication is that he's not permitted to cut his hair, he's not permitted to shave. So we're talking about a person who was released from his nidui either before chalamayid, right before Yom Tov or on chalamayid. Or if somebody made a neder, for example, not to shave. Someone took a neder not to shave, not to take a haircut, and he was released from the neder on chalamayid. V'hanozir, v'hamitzora, mitum asul ataraso. And a nazir, who's obviously not permitted to shave or take a haircut. A mitzora, who's obligated to allow his hair to grow as well. And both of these individuals achieved purity. They achieved purification on chalamayid. And so they ultimately, again, the idea being over here, and you could see, these are all individuals who essentially did not have the opportunity to shave or take a haircut before chalamayid. Therefore, again, they have a license to do so on chalamayid itself. These are the people who could launder their clothing on chalamayid. Habam dinas hayam, someone who comes from overseas, or mibeis hashivya, or someone who was released from captivity. Vayotze mibeis hasurin, or someone who was released from prison. Top of Yod Daled. Umenuda shetir lo chachamim, or again, someone who was excommunicated and then had his excommunication lifted or repealed by the chachamim. Or let's say somebody made a neder not to go ahead and launder his clothing, and he was released from the neder on chalamayid v'hutar. So we'll say all of these situations ultimately again are circumstances where you can launder your clothing on chalamayid. It's the same yisod, really the same exact yisod, namely being the idea that these people didn't have an opportunity to engage in the process of laundering their clothing before chalamayid, and therefore halacha l'maisa they have a license to do so on chalamayid. The Mishnah goes on, mitpachos hayadayim, hand towels, mitpachos hasabarim, barber's, now literally means barber's towels. What it means is, Rashi points out, the barber's cloth, which is the cloth that the barber used to put on. You know, they do it today also. You go for a haircut, the barber puts on the cloth so that the hair doesn't get all over you. That's called mitpachos hasapar, mitpachos hasafak, or bath towels. You are allowed to launder these on chalamayid. Again, we'll discuss why that is. These seems to be just on a most basic level because they're necessary for chalamayid use. A person doesn't have an inexhaustible supply of bath towels, so therefore I'm permitted, or again, hand towels, or for that matter, the barber who has the license to cut the hair of these individuals also needs his towels. And similarly, again, hazavin, v'hazavos, hanidos, v'hayoldos. Certainly, if a person is a zav or a zava, nidos and yoldos, these are all people who experience emissions, and because they experience emissions, they may need to launder their clothing or other items on a relatively regular basis. And anyone in general who has transitioned from a state of ritual impurity to purity, they are mutter to launder, ushar kol adam asur, and everyone else is asur. Again, we'll define the exact parameters of what the Mishnah is saying, but bigadol, in a general sense, the Mishnah is introducing us to the idea you can't take a haircut, you can't shave, you can't launder your clothing on chalamayid, unless, of course, there's an extenuating need. And the extenuating need can take one of two forms. Either you didn't have the ability to do so before Yom Tov, or you had the ability to do so before Yom Tov, but your circumstances are such that you still need to launder. For example, zavin, zavos, nidos, yoldos, people who have frequent emissions. Says the Gemara, ushar kol adam mai taima asurin. So ask the Gemara, what's the problem? Why can't a regular person shave or take a haircut or launder clothing on chalamayid? What's the issue here? Kedisnan. So the Gemara says it's like a Mishnah that we learned about. So we had this in Maseches Tainis. Anshe Mishmar va'anshe Maimod asrun l'saper l'chabes u'bechamishi mutar mnei kavod Shabbos. So we'll say the people of the Mishmar, remember again, the kahuna was split up into 24 Mishmaros. There were also ma'amados. We did this extensively in Maseches Tainus, where there were groups, there were cohorts of Kohanim, Yisraelim, Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. Some would go to the Beis HaMikdash, some would gather, Yisraelim would gather in the local towns. What's the halacha? They are not permitted to go ahead and launder their clothing, nor are they permitted to go ahead and shave, take a haircut over the course of their week that they're on duty. On Thursday of that week, they're permitted to do so. L'kavod Shabbos. V'amar Rabbi Bar Bachana Amar Rabbi Elazar, my time. What's the reason? Why can't the people of the Mishmar and the people of the Maimed, why can't they launder their clothing or take a haircut? Kadesh li'kansu le'mishmar san kishem menuvalin. In order that, what are we concerned about? See, if a person knows, right, a person knows anyway that he's going to have quote unquote a week off from work, right? The Kohen knows he's going to the Beis HaMikdash. The Leib is going to the Beis HaMikdash. The Yisrael is gathering in his town. So I'm going to be spending my whole week dedicated to tefillah, avoda. There's plenty of time to take care of my laundry and plenty of time to take care of my personal grooming needs during that week. And Chazal were concerned that a person is then going to enter into their week of the Mishmar or their week of the Maimed in an unkempt state. Therefore, Chazal said, so how do you ensure that people enter into the week of the Mishmar, the week of the Maimed, with proper grooming, properly prepared? By telling you can't shave and you can't take a haircut the week of, you can't launder your clothing the week of, that therefore by definition necessitates that I take care of these needs prior to the start of the Mishmar, the start of the Maimed. So the Gemara says, Hachanami, Kadesh le'yikansu l'regal keshem menuvalin. It's the same idea over here. Chazal were concerned that a person might enter into Yom Tiv in an unkempt state. Why should I take a haircut or shave? Before Yom Tiv, I could just do it on sheleimah. There's plenty of time. Or why should I take care of laundry right now? I could take care of laundry later on. Chazal were therefore were concerned that a person is going to enter into Yom Tiv, maybe with unclean clothing, or maybe not properly, with a proper haircut, with a proper shape, properly groomed. So therefore Chazal said, how do we ensure that people take care of their personal grooming needs and their laundry before Yom Tiv? By telling you, in the absence of an extenuating circumstance, you cannot shave, you cannot take a haircut, and you cannot launder your clothing on sheleimah. Incredible. So we'll say now the Gemara asked a couple of very interesting questions. By Rabbi Zera, Avdullah the Erev Haragel. But let's say, what happens in the following situation? What happens if a person lost an object? Right, a person lost an object. I lost my watch prior to Yom Tiv, and as a result, I spent all of Erev Yom Tiv looking for my watch. As a result of spending all of my Erev Yom Tiv looking for my watch, I didn't have a chance to get a haircut or to shave. So now what's the shaila? Do we say kevan da anis mutter? On one hand, we can say from the Mishnah, you see that extenuating circumstances allow you to shave and take a haircut and launder clothing on sheleimah, right? Again, remember, all of the cases of the Mishnah, someone comes from overseas, someone is released from captivity, from jail, somebody who had their neder annulled, all of these are extenuating circumstances. So here, I spent the entire Erev Yom Tiv looking for my lost object. That's an extenuating circumstance. That's not how I planned to spend my Erev Yom Tiv. So do we say, since it's an oni, since it's an extenuating circumstance, I can go ahead and take a haircut or shave or launder on sheleimah? Oh dilma, kevan de lo muchacha mil salo. On the other hand, this is very interesting. Maybe the only license to go ahead and shave or to take a haircut or to launder on sheleimah is when the nature of your extenuating circumstances are such that they're public knowledge. In other words, if you look at the list of extenuating circumstances in the Mishnah, these are all things that have a certain element of publicity. They're known, right? If you're coming back from overseas, people know that. You get out of jail, people know that. You get out of captivity, people know these things. So maybe the only time that you're permitted to go ahead and shave and take a haircut on sheleimah is not only when there's extenuating circumstances, but extenuating circumstances which are publicly known. Because that way, if people see you grooming on sheleimah, they're going to know why it is that you have a heter to do so. But again, in a situation like this where I was looking for my watch, that's not known. That's not a publicly known situation. So perhaps, again, that should not create a license to go ahead and shave and to haircut on sheleimah. To which the Gemara says, Amra Bai Yomru, Kala srikin asurin srike baitos mutarin. So we'll say, so this is an expression that we've seen we've seen many times. The idea over here is as follows. The Mishnah Maseches Pesachim writes that one is not permitted to make srikin. Srikin is like a matzah wafer with an image on it. So normally, how would you make it? You'd go ahead and you'd have a dough and you'd etch in the image. The reason we don't want you making that on Pesach is pretty obvious, or even before Pesach, for use on Pesach, is because making the image takes time, and there's a concern that the matzah may become chametz. Well, there was a guy by the name of Baitos, and Baitos had a great idea, right? Baitos had a stamp, so you don't have to etch in the image, you could just stamp the image on the dough. So ultimately, here's the problem. So technically speaking, that should be permitted. What's the problem? When someone sees a matzah with an image on it, they have no idea if somebody did that by hand, in other words, etched it in, or if that's just the stamp. So the problem is if you allow it, then at the end of the day, it will lead people to make mistakes. That's the lashon. Yomru kol ha-srikin asur. Should we say all of the srikin, right? All of the designer matzahs should be asur, but the designer matzah of baitos is mutter. So of course, such a situation like that is untenable because ultimately, again, it's going to create an incredible amount of confusion. So now using that logic, it would appear based on this that unless you have publicly known extenuating circumstances, we don't really want you shaving or taking a haircut or laundering on sheleimah, because people aren't going to know the nature of your circumstances and they're just going to assume that you've decided to do these activities on sheleimah, and they may glean for themselves also a heter to be able to do this. To which the Gemara Tzulotame, Chadam Rabbi Asi, Am Rabbi Yochanan, so what about the following case? We learned, or we will learn. What happens if somebody only has one article of clothing? So remember again, we just said before, laundry, said in the Mishnah, laundering is asr, unless of course it's an extenuating circumstance. Well, let's say a person only has one article of clothing. That's an extenuating circumstance as well. But it's so I'm allowed to launder my one article of clothing on sheleimah. The Gemara says, but here's the problem with that. Hasam nami yomru kol ha-srikin asurin srikei baitos mutarin. Here's the problem. The problem with that case is, I will say, no one knows that I have one article of clothing. How does anyone know that? So if they see me laundering clothing on sheleimah or wearing a freshly laundered garment on sheleimah, so no one knows that I did that because I only have one garment. They're going to once again assume that perhaps laundering on sheleimah is permitted. It's the same problem. In other words, I understand in a case where my extenuating circumstances are of a public nature. Then everyone understands my circumstance and everyone understands why it is that I'm doing these things on sheleimah. But the problem is if you have a quote-unquote a private circumstance, people don't know about that. They don't know what to do with that. To which the Gemara says, We'll say here's the difference. Your belt testifies that. We'll say if a person only has one garment, so what do you do when you're laundering the garment? What do? You put on your cloak, you close up your cloak tight, and you wear your belt on top of your cloak. When people see me wearing my belt on top of my cloak, they're going to know that I have one garment and I'm currently laundering it. That's why I'm wearing my cloak like a garment, because I don't have another garment. So your belt shows. In other words, your belt telegraphs. Your belt communicates the nature of your extenuating circumstance. Ravashi Masni boy Rabbi Zero Uman Sha'avdalo Aveda Erev Haregam Mahu. So therefore, again, I just want to point out. So the Gemara doesn't seem to resolve these issues, or I should say, it does resolve. In other words, it resolves it by seemingly saying that the only time that an ones situation, an extenuating circumstance, allows you to shave, to get a haircut, to launder your clothing, is when the ones is known. It's of a public nature. But if it's a totally private nature, it appears that doesn't create a heter to allow me to go ahead and do these activities. Now the Gemara asks another question. Ravash saying, "By Rabbi Zera, Uman sha'avdullah aveda erev haregel." I will say, what about in the following case? An uman, right? So a craftsman. So I will say, let's give a good example. Rashi gives the example of a sapar. Let's say this: the barber. The barber lost his watch on Erev Yom Tov. Now I will say, if the barber loses his watch on Erev Yom Tov and he's looking forward to a whole day of Yom Tov, what's going to happen? Everyone's going to know. Why is everyone going to know? Because the line is forming outside of the barber shop. So here is an individual who lost an object, so the barber is going to look for his object, but the nature, and therefore again, he doesn't end up getting a haircut or shaving Erev Yom Tov, and the nature of his ones is known by dint of the fact that he's a service provider, and a necessary service provider on Erev Yom Tov. So is that enough of a public thing that would allow him now to go ahead and take a haircut or shave or do his laundry on Chalamayid. So do we say Kevan de Uman hu Muchamilsa, since he's an Uman, right? He's a necessary figure. He's a craftsman. People need him. They're going to know about his own. They said he's looking for his watch. How do they know that? Because I've been waiting for a haircut for an hour and a half. That's how I know. O Dilma Kevan de Lo Muchamilsa Kihanach Lo. Or perhaps we say the opposite. Maybe what we look for is not as much the person's personal circumstances, but rather the type of ones, the type of extenuating circumstance that becomes publicly known. So losing your watch is not the type of public circumstance which becomes is not the type of circumstance which becomes publicly known. Contrast that with the cases of the Mishnah: someone who's released from prison, someone who's released from captivity, someone who returns from overseas travel. The nature of those circumstances is that they are publicly known. So how do we analyze this case of the Uman who loses a personal object? Do we say on one hand, well, it's a personal object, and therefore, again, that's not the type of circumstances that become publicly known? Or do we say, no, because he's an Uman, right? Because he's a service provider, and he's not going to be providing that service in Erev Yom Tiv, everyone's going to say, hey, where's Ruvain the barber? Oh, he's looking for his watch. So his circumstances become known, not because of the nature of the circumstances, but because of the nature of the person. So how do we paskin? The Gemara says, teku. That it's a good kasha. It's a kasha. So also what you begin to see really is that this tension about do you need the circumstances, the nature of the circumstances to create the publicity, or is it enough if the person creates the publicity? That in and of itself is a unknown. That's a machlokes, or you shouldn't even say it's a machlokes. The Gemara just does not reach a conclusion about it. Beautiful. So as I remember again, the first example of an extenuating circumstance which would allow you to go ahead and shave or take a haircut or do laundry on Chalamayid would be someone who returns from travel overseas. Says the Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Why not? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Disanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Habam Medina Salam no yigaleach mipnei sheliyatza shelo b'reshus. Let's listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you come back from overseas travel, that's not a license to get a haircut or to shave on Chalamayid. Why? You traveled of your own volition. All right, come back earlier. Who told you? Who told you to start going on a pleasure cruise? Who told you to start going out and traveling? So Rabbi Yehuda says, if you're traveling of your own volition and you come back too late that you can't shave or take a haircut before Chalamayid, that's not a heter to take a haircut or shave on Chalamayid itself. Amar Rava. So listen to this. What I'll say. So Rava qualifies this a little bit. He said, now what I want to point out is that the Mishnah doesn't make any type of distinction. The Mishnah just says, Eilu megalchin b'moed, who here are the people who could take a haircut or shave on Chalamayid, someone who returns from overseas travel. But the Mishnah itself doesn't make a distinction as to the nature of the overseas travel. So Rava therefore comes along and says as follows, Loshut divrei hakol aser. We'll say, if literally you're just traveling for the sake of traveling, Rashi says, Im yatsa shelo l'tzorech v'lo yatsa ela kedei loshut ba'olam. You're going on vacation. You want to see the world. You want to see the world, right? So if you're traveling just for pure pleasure, you want to see the world, that's fine. Geh gesund hate, enjoy. But at the end of the day, if you get back before Chalamayid, you don't have enough time to go ahead and take a haircut or shave, that does not generate a heter to do so on Chalamayid. Right? The heter to do so on Chalamayid is only when there was an extenuating circumstance that was beyond your control. But if you're traveling of your own volition, there's not a heter. Limizonos, what happens if a person was traveling for the sake of parnasa? Divrei hakol mutter. Everyone agrees that's called quote-unquote an extenuating circumstance. By the sweat of your brow, you earn your parnasa. That's Cheshbon Baruch who said to Adam Arishon. So traveling for parnasa is considered to be ones, and therefore if you did not return early enough before Chalamayid, before Yom Tiv, to be able to shave and take a haircut, you could do so on Chalamayid. So we'll say, where's the machlokes? Lo nechleku ela laharviach. Listen to this. Laharviach. We'll say, what about if a person's not traveling for parnasa, but traveling for profit? Namely, I have my parnasa. Baruch Shem, I have my parnasa. I'm traveling to make extra money. I'm traveling for an additional deal. So we'll say, so how do you look at that? So one opinion says, well, traveling for profit, for additional profit, not for parnasa or additional profit, that's like vacation. That's like vacation. And therefore, if you get back too close to Yom Tov that you don't have a chance to take a haircut or shave, you do not have a license to do so on Chalamayid. And the other opinion says, no, that's still called Mizonos. That's still called Parnasa. That you want to make more money? Okay, everybody wants to make more money. That's called for Parnasa, and therefore, Halach Lamais, if you get back too close to Yom Tov, you could shave, take a haircut, and Chalamayid. So also let's analyze. Meisvei, Amar Rabbi, Nirin de Rabbi Huda Kishatza Shelo B'Shus. Rabbi Huda's position seems to make sense when you left of your own volition. So if you're traveling of your own volition, right, you don't have to travel, you're choosing to travel, then halacha l'maisa, you don't have a heter to shave on Chalamayid. And the words of the Chum seem to be true when you went with Rishus. Now let's analyze this. Says the Gemara, my shelo birshus, what does it mean? Shelo birshus, ilema loshut. If you say that, it means that a person is just traveling for pleasure, just to see the world. So no, v'ha amrit divrei hakol aser. We said everyone agrees that that is going to be aser. Ve'ela lemizonos. And also when we say aser, means you're not going to have a heter to shave on Chalamayid based on that. Ve'ela lemizonos. Rather, it must be that you're traveling for parnasa. Well, traveling for parnasa, v'ha amrit divrei hakol mutter. Everyone agrees that if you're traveling for parnasa, rather, the Gemara says, Ve'ela laharvicha. Rather, it must be that we're talking about a case where a person is traveling for the sake of making additional profit. V'ha amrit nirin David Rabbi Yehuda b'ha. The Gemara said, but you just said before that it appears that we follow the position of Rabbi Yehuda. Hachi kamar, that's what it means to say. Hachi kamar, nirin David Rabbi Yehuda l'Rabbanon, kishiyatza shelo birshus. Ultimately, again, the Rabbanon agree with Rabbi Yehuda in a situation of a person who was yatsa shelo birshus, which means you went out of your own volition. What does that mean practically? Umaynihu lashut. That means to travel. You decided to go out to travel. Shafilu chachamim lo nechleku alav ella laharvicha. Because even the chachamim ultimately only disagree with Rabbi Yehuda in a case of where a person travels to make additional profit. The chachamim will say additional profit, that's still called parnasa. Rabbi Yehuda will say, no, that's not called parnasa. That's called, travel. That's called pleasure. That's called your own volition. Avaloshut module. But ultimately, again, if halach l'maisa, a person is just going to travel and they get caught up with their travel, and as a result of that, they don't make it back before Yom Tiv, the Rabbanon would agree with Rabbi Yehuda that halach l'maisa, that's not a heter to shave on Chalamayid. V'nirin divrei Rabbanon Rabbi Yehuda b'shiyatzer b'shos. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda will agree with Rabbanon in the case of Yatzer Birshus. What does Yatzer Birshus mean? Nihu lemizonos, for Parnasa. That if a person traveling for Parnasa, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree. Shafilu Rabbi Yehuda lo nechlak aleim ela laharvicha. Aval lemizonos modelahu. Even Rabbi Yehuda only disagrees when a person is traveling for profit. Rabbi Yehuda holds for profit. That's called discretionary travel. So for profit, that's discretionary travel. But for the travel for parnasa, that's called quote-unquote obligatory travel. And therefore, if you got caught up or unable to return back home in time for Chalamayid, halacha l'maisa, one would have the right to go ahead and shave during Chalamayid. So I'll just point out to you the Shulchan Aruch Paskins here. This is in Aruch Chaim, Simin Taf Kuf Lamid Aleph Sif Dalid. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows: V'hu shelo yatsa me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz l'tayel. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that halacha l'maisa, as long as you are traveling for a purpose. Now, purpose can mean mizonos, ikar parnasa, your primary livelihood, or harvacha, profit, right, additional livelihood, as long as it's under the umbrella of livelihood, that, and again, a person gets caught up and as a result is unable to get back in time and to prepare for Yom Tiv, shaving, haircutting, laundering in time, you could do so on Chalamayid. But if a person went on vacation, a person went on vacation, and as a result of vacation, I got back late, my flight got delayed, I wasn't able to get back in time, there would not be a heter to shave, or to take a haircut, or to launder on Chalamayid itself. What's another interesting case? Amr Shmuel, Katan, we'll say 6 lines up from the bottom. Amr Shmuel, Katan hanolad b'moed. Let's listen to this case. Let's say a child is born on Chalamayid. So we're also talking about a baby who has a lot of hair, Kanai Nahara. So let's say the baby has a lot of hair and the baby needs a haircut. So ultimately, again, you could go ahead and give the baby a haircut on Chalamayid. On Chalamayid. Why? So Gemara says, She'ein lecha beis ha'asurin gadol mizeh. For there is no greater incarceration, there's no greater jail than the womb. In other words, that the Gemara says a child who is born is like a person who came out of jail. It's like a person literally, again, who was freed from his incarceration. There's no greater incarceration, no greater jail than the womb. Therefore, again, you could give the baby a haircut on Chalamayid. And I will say, if you think about this, what a dramatic thing to say, because after all, again, we're familiar with the Gemara Maseches Nida, and the Gemara says that when the baby is in utero, ultimately they learn Torah with the Malach, right? The angel learns Kol Torah Kula, Ner Doluk, there's a candle lit above his head. The Gemara describes it as an incredibly spiritual and holy experience. Now the Gemara says there's no greater jail than the womb. And perhaps what Chazal is sensitizing us to, Rabbi says as follows. See, what's the notion of jail? What's the notion of jail? That a person can't accomplish, a person can't do, a person can't change the world, a person is stymied in their asiyah, in their dynamic activity. It's great to learn with the malach. It is, don't get me wrong. I'm sure we all enjoyed it immensely. But at the end of the day, what I really want to do is I want to accomplish. I want to do. I want to, in my own way, in my own small and sometimes even unnoticed way, change the world, infuse more light, make a difference. And when the child is in the womb, as wonderful as it is to learn Kol Torah Kula, as wonderful as it is to communicate with the Malach, as wonderful as it is to almost be more Malach than man, that's not the world I want to live in. That's not where I want to be. I want to be in the world of dynamic activity. I want to be in the world where I could do something. I want to be in the world where I can make a difference. I want to be in the world where I could affect change. And therefore the Gemara says, as saintly, and as holy as the womb may be, it's mamish like a jail. So the Gemara goes right there. But Moed didn't make Carlo. Now what this sounds like is, when can you give the baby a haircut? If the baby is born on Chalamayid. But if the baby was born before Chalamayid, he would not be permitted to go out and give them a haircut. To which the Gemara says, Masev Rab Pinchas, Kol Elu Sh'amru Mutar Legalech B'Moed, Mutar Legalech B'Mei Avlo. So let's listen to this interesting case. The Gemara says, any situation where it's permitted to go ahead and shave or take a haircut on Chalamayid, those same circumstances would allow you to go ahead and do these same activities during one's avelos, during one's mourning period. I will say, we're going to get into Hilchos Avelos more tomorrow in Mirz Hashem. Ha'asr legalech b'moed, asr legalcha me'avlo, which tells you that if there's a circumstance which would preclude you from shaving or haircutting on Chalamayid, it would also be asr during the days of your avelos. Says the Gemara Amud Beis, Vi'i amrit katan isbei plukta. And if you want to say there's a distinction for children, ultimately, again, a baby born before Chalamayid can't take haircut on Chalamayid, cannot take haircut on Chalamayid. A baby born on Chalamayid, you can cut his hair on Chalamayid. If that's the case, then you have a situation of a baby who can't have a haircut on Chalamayid, which, using the formula we just said before, would also mean that a child can't have a haircut during the days of his avelos. But here's the problem. The Gemara says, Nin says, avelos no heges bekatan. That teaches me then that the concept of avelos, the concept of mourning, applies to a child. But it's not true. Vatanyo, mikaron lekatim ne agmas nafesh. So we're going to learn this incredible Gemara in a couple of days from now, actually in about 10 days from now. The Gemara is going to talk about this concept that a child is not subject to the laws of mourning. There's no avelos by a katan, no mourning by a child, which kind of most basically, a child is not obligated in any mitzvahs. We'll see that what we do is, Rahman al-Islam, when a child loses a close relative, we tear their clothing. But we don't tear their clothing, we don't do kriya on them because they're chayav in kriya. We do kriya on them because it evokes the feeling of pain and loss for everyone who's around. Anyone who's ever seen chas v'shalom, a child do kriya or a child say kaddish, it's overwhelming. So, but the point that the Gemara is making over here is the child is not subject to avelos, in which case your formula doesn't work. Ravashi mi katani ha'asurin. The Gemara Ravashi doesn't mean to say that it's an absolute rule that whoever can't go ahead and do certain activities on Chalamayid can't do them during the days of his avelos. So, rather, what it means is, for some people, this principle applies. Namely, again, very often they're intertwined. Whatever you can't do on Chalamayid, you can do during avelos. Whatever you can do during Chalamayid, you can do on avelos. That applies for many circumstances. One of the situations for which this rule will not apply is when it comes to a katan, when it comes to a child. Says the Gemara, So the Gemara says, Ameimar says, Ameimar v'tim Rav Shisha b'rei Rav Idi masniachi. So Ameimar, others say Shisha b'rei Rav Idi. They had a different version of this. In their version, they had like this: Amar Shmuel, Katan mutar legal chaba Moed. You're allowed to give a child a haircut on Chalamayid. Lo shna nolad b'Moed, lo shna nolad meikara. Whether the baby was born before Chalamayid or the baby was born on Chalamayid, if the baby needs a haircut, you give the baby a haircut. Amra Pinchas af anan nami tanin. And we also learn this concept. Kol elusha amru mutar legalech b'Moed, mutar legalech b'mei avlo. So I will say, interestingly enough, we said, in any situation where halacha l'maaseh you could go ahead and take a haircut or shave on Chalamayid, you're also permitted to take a haircut and shave during one's avelos. Ha-asr legalech b'Moed, but what's the rule? Therefore, again, if it's asr to shave or take a haircut on Chalamayid, it would also be asr legalech b'mei avlo. It would also be asr to go ahead and shave or take a haircut during avelos. So says the Gemara, I amrit katan asr. If you say that therefore a katan cannot shave or take a haircut on Chalamayid, nim says avelos nohages bekatan. If a katan can't take a haircut on Chalamayid, a katan also can't take a haircut during avelos. Because remember, again, we're espousing this avelos Chalamayid connection. And that if that's the case, that's not true. V'tanya, mekaron lekatan mipnei agmas nefesh. And remember again, halacha l'maisa, the only reason we tear kriya, right, we tear the article of clothing of a katan, is just to accentuate and exacerbate the pain of the adults who are around, not for the katan. Amar Ravashi, once again, mi katani ha'asurin dilma yesh mehen asr v'yesh mehen mutar. To which the Gemara says, you're right. You're right. At the end of the day, the relationship between Chalamayid and Avelos is not absolute. Now, more often than not, it works. Whatever is asr on Chalamayid is going to be asr during Avelos, and whatever is permitted during Chalamayid will be permitted during Avelos. But there is an exception. The exception to the rule is a katan, is a child, right? A baby, you could give the baby or the child a haircut on Chalamayid if there's an extenuating need. But yet again, ultimately, again, the halachos of Avelos will not apply to a child, right? So the halachos of Chalamayid will apply to a child. The halachos of Avelos will not apply to a child. Good. That's how the Gemara ends off. Avel eno noeg avelusa borega. So we'll say, so now the Gemara is taking, now that we introduced the concept of Avelos, so the Gemara takes a step back and the Gemara says, okay, what about Avelos on Chalamayid? Or for that matter, not just Chalamayid, on Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, an Avel does not conduct himself in accordance with his morning practices on Yom Tiv. Why not? Now, we're going to see, this means a variety of things, but on the most basic level, we'll see the most extreme cases. Rachmana litzlan lo aleinu, a person loses a relative. They're sitting Shiva prior to Yom Tiv. Yom Tiv comes, it ends the Shiva. By extension, we'll see, let's say a person is not sitting Shiva, a person already sat Shiva, they're in Shloshim. Yom Tiv comes, cuts off the Shloshim. Yom Tiv goes ahead and effectively ends whatever period of mourning the mourner currently finds him or herself in. So the Gemara says, where does this come from? Where does this concept come from? Shneimar, v'samachta b'chagecha. The Torah says, you shall rejoice on your Yom Tiv. So I will say the idea of is because there's a biblical obligation to rejoice, therefore the biblical obligation to rejoice goes ahead and essentially trumps the personal obligation to mourn. Incredible. So the Gemara says, velos de meikara. If a person was in avelos before Yom Tiv, havi asi asei drabim v'dachi asei diachid. The positive commandment, which is a collective commandment on all of Klal Yisrael, v'samachta b'chagecha, trumps the personal obligation to mourn. V'avelos tahashta, and if we're talking about a person who becomes an avel on Yom Tiv, halo asya asei diachid v'dachi asei drabim. The personal obligation to mourn does not set aside the communal obligation to rejoice on Yom Tiv. So I will say, so whether again a person was an avel before Yom Tiv or a person experiences a loss on Yom Tiv, mourning could never occur on Yom Tiv itself. And the reason for that is because of the biblical directive, v'samachta b'chagecha. One should rejoice on the Yom Tiv. So let's listen to this. Menuda ma'ushinog niduya berega. What's the defining situation? We spoke of this in the Mishnah. The menuda is a person who is excommunicated for some transgression. He's excommunicated. Now, we'll say the person in excommunication essentially conducts himself like a person who is in avelos, like a person who is mourning. So the Gemara says, what happens? Does a menuda, a person who is excommunicated, does he conduct himself in accordance with his excommunication mourning practices on Yom Tiv itself? On Yom Tiv itself. So the Gemara says, So I will say there are different things. In other words, he also has to tear his clothing. He also has to let his hair grow long. So the child is, does he conduct himself with these practices on Yom Tiv or not? So I'm Rav Yosef Tashma. Done in Dinei Nefashos, Fidinei Makas, Fidinei Maminis. We adjudicate capital cases and cases regarding lashes and monetary cases on Chalamayid. We take care of all of these cases on Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, V'ilo tzayis dina mishamtinale. And if a person doesn't show up for their din Torah, or a person won't listen to the ruling of the Beis Din, we excommunicate them. Now, if you would tell me that the morning practices of excommunication don't apply on Chalamayid or on Yom Tiv, mishumas va'asi meikara, asi regel dachile, hashta mishamtinale anan. So I will say, if you would tell me that Yom Tiv sets aside the morning practices of excommunication, if that's so, then if a person who is already excommunicated, Yom Tiv comes and lifts his morning practices, then how could it be that the Gemara just said that Beis Din would excommunicate a person on Yom Tiv itself? Doesn't make sense. Abaye says maybe not. Maybe when it means that mishamtina le, it doesn't literally mean we excommunicate him on Yom Tiv. Rather, what does it mean? Or really on Chalamayid? Rather, what does it mean? Vidilma le'iyune bedina. Maybe it just means that on Chalamayid, we won't go ahead and actually excommunicate someone, but rather what we'll do is we'll examine the facts of the case. Beis Din will examine the facts of the case so that they are prepared to issue a ruling right after Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, Di'ilo temahachi, because if you don't say this, Dine nefashas diktani hachanami dekatlinale, because remember again, the Bryce also said that the Beis Din adjudicates capital cases. If you take that literally, that they're actually adjudicating capital cases, is that possible to do that on Yom Tiv? Vaha kamimani v'simchas Yom Tiv. I will say, if the Beis Din is actually adjudicating capital cases on Yom Tiv, then what? Then at the end of the day, they are going to go ahead and be precluded from engaging in Simchas Yom Tiv, enjoying the Yom Tiv. Why? Listen to this. Tisanya. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Minayin l'Sanhedrin, Shehar Guesan Efeshein Tomin Kolos Hayom. Rabbi Akiva says that the Sanhedrin is going to execute someone. They're obligated to fast the day that the sentencing is carried out. How do we know that? Talmud Lomar, Lo Sochlu Aladam. Literally, do not eat on the blood. That when Beis Din is spilling blood, they judge someone that they're going to be put to death. You can't eat that day. So therefore, look what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying, we said before, right? Remember, what are we trying to figure out? Here's what we know. In regular Avelos, a person loses a loved one, Yom Tiv comes, and either if a person was in Avelos before Yom Tiv comes and cuts off the Avelos. We're going to see if a person becomes an Avel on Yom Tiv essentially delays the Avelos until after Yom Tiv. What about the morning practices associated with excommunication? Does the person who is excommunicated, the menuda, does he observe those morning practices on Yom Tiv or not? Well, the Gemara wants to say, the Brisa told us that they excommunicate people on Chalamayid. So if you're excommunicating people on Chalamayid, then what? It must be that they're observing their morning practices on Chalamayid as well. To which the Gemara says, no. Maybe when it says that they're excommunicating someone, it doesn't really mean they're excommunicating. It means they'll examine the merits of the case on Chalamayid, so that after Yom Tiv, Beis Din is ready to go ahead and deliver a psak, and then excommunicate the person. The Gemara says that has to be the answer, that has to be the explanation. Why? Because the same Brisa said that they adjudicate capital cases. Could it be that we're putting someone to death on Yom Tiv? Could that be? After all, the Gemara says, Rabbi Kiva says, the day that a Beis Din would excommunicate someone, you would have to fast, which means that there'd be a day of Yom Tiv where the Dayanim would not be fulfilling the biblical obligation of V'samachta b'chagecha, to rejoice on the Yom Tiv. So it must mean when the Gemara says that they execute someone on Beis Din, it doesn't literally mean, it means they examine the merits of the case, they don't paskin, and after Yom Tiv they paskin. So too, when it talks about excommunicating people, maybe it means they examine the merits of the case, but don't actually do the excommunication until after Yom Tiv. To which the Gemara says, Amrulay imkain nimtzeis ma'ana es din. I both say this is very interesting. There's a concept of inu hadin, which means a court is not permitted to delay judgment. It's considered to be unfair to the litigants to delay judgment. So if that's the case, that Beis Din is going to examine the merits of the case and essentially be ready to paskin, but because of a technicality, they're not going to paskin until later, that's wrong. That seems to be wrong. That seems to be a wrong approach. To which the Gemara says, rather, what are the Rabbi say? This is actually incredible. So here's how it works. So in fact, the Gemara wants to suggest that Beis Din will go ahead Beis Din will go ahead and halacha l'maisa go ahead and adjudicate capital cases on Yom Tiv. They will. But 1 second, but how does it work? How does it work with the fact that they have to fast on the day that they're administering a death penalty, and yet that will prevent them from enjoying their Simchas Yom Tiv? Here we go. Asu mitzafra. The Gemara says they go ahead and they sit in session in the morning, and they go ahead and they examine the case and essentially reach a conclusion. But they don't paskin. They go home, they have their Sudas Yom Tiv. Achli v'shasu kuliyama, they enjoy the day of Yom Tiv. V'hadir asu b'shkias achama. And they come back, Beis Din once again. So they adjourn. So in the morning they get together, they examine the case, pretty much know what they're going to rule, but don't rule. Go home, eat, drink, enjoy the Yom Tiv. They reassemble a little bit before sunset. They go ahead, v'gamrinon ledina. They go ahead and they pass they do the sentencing. They pass the death sentence, the katli, and they kill the guy right before the end of the day. So I will say like this. Interestingly enough, you have a couple. So here's what you have. So they'll meet in the morning, discuss the merits of the case, essentially come to a conclusion without going in and handing down the sentence. They'll go home, enjoy Yom Tiv, eat, drink, enjoy their Yom Tiv. So therefore they're fulfilling the biblical obligation of v'samachta b'chagecha. They'll reassemble sometime before sunset, give the psak din, right? Go ahead, hand down the sentence, execute the guy. They'll fast the remainder of that day, right? Which is until when? Until nightfall. So that's fine. They're not having another Suda anyway. They'll fast the remainder of that day, thereby fulfilling Rabbi Akiva's dictum, but at the same time not going ahead and missing out on a day of Simchas Yom Tiv. So and I'll just point out something amazing. The Rambam codifies this. The Rambam says, this is in Hilchos Sanhedrin Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Hey. The Rambam writes, Mishin is Chai Misa B'Chol Shamoed. If somebody became liable to a death penalty on Chol Hamoed, Ma'ainin Bedino, we assemble in the morning, we look into the merits of his case. Va'ochlin Beizin V'shosin Acharkach Va'acharkach Gomer Nes Dino Samuch L'Shkias Achama B'Hargin. So the Rambam quotes this Halacha L'Maisa. So we'll examine the merits of the case in the morning. Don't paskin. Go home, eat, drink, enjoy Simchas Yom Tiv, reconvene sometime before sunset, deliver the sentence, execute the individual, fast for whatever is remaining in the day, and then go on with your Yom Tiv. That's the halacha. Codifying the Rambam. I was just thinking about this. It's incredible to think about this. Can you imagine being a dayan on a Beis Din which is going to hand down a death sentence? Remember, again, after the morning session, you know already the guy is going to be put to death. You know that because you reach the conclusion. You're just not delivering the verdict until later on in the day. So what's the pshat? How could a person go home? And eat and drink and have a regular Yom Tiv and then go in and come back to the Beis Din? So I will say, I think it's something amazing. I think what the Gemara is teaching us is, I would imagine that when that dayan goes home, he's not having a regular Yom Tiv, right? It's not like a regular day. He knows that someone's going to die, and he knows that it's his decision, together with the other dayan that's putting someone to death. So when he goes home, I guarantee you, like in his heart, he's not filled with simcha, but he goes through the motions. Because I will say, sometimes in life, you just have to go through the motions. Sometimes in life, you have to do what you have to do. You have to get the job done. Maybe you're not feeling it in the same way. Maybe you're not experiencing it in the same way. But sometimes, we all go through this, right? We have days when we wake up and, you know what, the truth is, like, my head's not in the right place. My heart's not in the right place. But there are things I have to do. I have to be there for my spouse. I have to be there for my children. I have to be there in my profession. I have to show up. I have to show up even when I am not feeling it. So what the Gemara is saying over here is, don't think for a second that the dayan goes ahead and comes home and, what's for lunch? What's for the Suda? Let's sing a zemer. Let's this, divrei Torah. And everything is hunky-dory. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. And then, you know what? I got to run. We have to deliver that death sentence. I'm sure the dayan feels differently. But sometimes you have to do what you have to do, no matter how you're feeling. Isn't this the job of a yid? There are days I show up, I don't feel like davening, I don't feel like kavana. There are days that I don't feel like doing certain mitzvahs. So sometimes you don't feel it, but you still have to do it. Sometimes you don't feel it, but you still have to go through the motions. Sometimes you don't feel it, but you still have to show up. Sometimes the dayan doesn't feel simchas Yom Tiv, but he still has to show up. He still has to show up. It also teaches us another lesson, that in life we have to learn how to compartmentalize. which I think is an incredible yisod. I will say, sometimes things happen in life. We've all had this experience where something bad happens during the day, and you're very upset, and angry. And you're about to walk into your house. And in that moment when you walk into your house, you have to make a conscious decision. Do I bring all of the negativity of my day with me through that door? Or do I say, you know what? I'm going to put that away for now. It's important. I have to deal with it. I'm not done with it. I have to figure out what to do with it. But right now, I can't bring it with me into the house. Right now, it cannot follow me in. The power of compartmentalizing. And this is difficult because many of us, we take everything with us wherever we go. And sometimes we make that mistake of walking into the door, and maybe there's a spouse that's so happy to see me, and maybe a person is zochet to have children who are so happy to see them. And I come in and I'm upset and I'm distant and I'm angry and I'm frustrated. And they didn't do anything. They're just happy to see me. They're just happy to spend a few moments with me, and I'm bringing all of the baggage of the day with me. The Gemara is teaching us sometimes you have to learn the art of compartmentalizing. And compartmentalizing says, the Dayan's going to go home. He's going to have his su'udah. He knows where he's been, and he knows what he has to do later on in the day. But sometimes you just got to put it in check. Compartmentalize and move forward. So 2 incredible yisodos from this Gemara. 2 incredible yisodos. Yisod number 1, that sometimes even if you're not feeling it, you just got to show up. And yisod number 2, you have to learn to compartmentalize in order to be successful in life. The Gemara goes like, Rabbi Toshma o menuda shetir chachamim. So let's remember again, the Mishnah did say that a menuda, right, so a person who was excommunicated, who was released from his excommunication on Yom Tiv, is permitted to take a haircut and shave, which sounds like the morning practices of nidui are still in effect on Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, Amarava mi katani shetiru chachamim, shetiru lo chachamim, katani da'azulu paise lebaldine, v'asi kamei l'rabbanan v'shalin. But say, no, maybe that's a different case. Maybe that's talking about a situation of a person who was put in excommunication because he went ahead and first of all, take a look at Rashi. Tashma menuda shetiru lo chachamim kasaga daitcha hitiru lo kol menuda nidui beregel deina nidui rak. So say the way you could understand that statement in the Mishnah of chachamim shetiru means that when Yom Tiv comes, the chachamim release every excommunicated person from his excommunication. That essentially Yom Tiv comes, the morning practices of someone who is excommunicated are lifted. To which the Gemara says, no, maybe not. Rava says, maybe that's not what it's talking about. Maybe what it means is a guy was excommunicated because of some interpersonal infraction. He did something to someone else. As a result, he was excommunicated. Maybe over the course of Yom Tiv or over the course of Chalamayid, the perpetrator goes over to the victim and makes amends. So if he made amends for his interpersonal affront, for his interpersonal transgression, under that case, Chazal would go ahead and lift the morning practices. But it's quite possible that in the absence of that, halacha l'maisa, the morning practices associated with a person excommunication would still remain on Yom Tiv. Shabbos, we'll stop over here for today. We're going to continue the sugya. We're not finished with it yet. We're going to continue the sugya along with throw in a couple of other cases, and then we'll see how the Rambam paskins over here. We'll say, if Shekayach, beautiful new start to the 3rd parak of Moed Katan, such a zchus to be able to learn with you. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you in person, but it is such a zchus to be able to continue our limud together. This is the beauty of the daf. Doesn't stop. Wherever we are, whenever we are, Baruch Hashem, a zchus to continue to plow through this beautiful masechta with all of you. Have a wonderful day. Shekayach.